UNDP, and he will be speaking to us on the topic of business and human rights. Now, the UNDP is partnering, it's actually one of the lead partners for the annual CRB conference, which is scheduled to take place from the 27th to the 29th, which is barely a few days away. And this is a conference that will be held virtually. And together, UNDP and CRB have co-curated a session on promoting growth and resilience on the United Nations guiding principles on business and through business and promoting growth and resilience through the UNGPs on the business and human rights. And this is a session that's scheduled for the 28th of October, where we've invited a host of experts to share their perspectives on the topic. And of course, this will be between 2 p.m. to 3:30 p.m. So request everybody to register for the conference and to sort of join us for this session or for a more nuanced discussion on the topic. We've recently seen, of course, that that there's a lot of accent that's been placed on business and human rights, particularly in the context of the whole rebuilding, rebooting, reviving of economies world over. And we've seen that in the recent past, some of the South Asian countries, come out, release their respective national action plans on business and human rights. Of course, India is in the process of developing its national action plan on business and human rights. We've seen internationally that there are laws that are being drafted, negotiated, even enforced. So clearly what we are seeing is that going forward, business and human rights is going to be that decisive factor in determining what kind of competitive advantage a country can command in the global markets, the kind of investment that it can attract, the kind of trade volumes that it can boost. So there's a whole host of things, that this particular topic of business and human rights impacts, and we will of course not be able to unpack and unravel all the elements threadbare here on this LinkedIn Live session. So we'll try and focus our attention to some key elements, and these would particularly and typically be looking at what are some of the regional trends, regional developments that we are seeing, the key developments and key trends there. How do we see some of the global value chains evolving, reorienting and getting restructured, and sort of how business and human rights is impacting, supplier-buyer relationship across the globe. So these would be some of the aspects that we'll try and get some insights into from Shaun Deez. And without any further ado, I would like to first introduce Shaun Deez to everybody and then welcome him to the conversation and the LinkedIn Live today. So Shaun Deez is a lawyer and human rights specialist with a background in trade policy and humanitarian affairs. Prior to his admission to legal practice, Shaun worked for the Pacific Basin Economic Council and the East-West Center on Asia-Pacific Trade and investment issues. He then expanded his field of interest, working with refugees and displaced populations as an attorney for the US Department of Justice. And then as a program manager for the International Rescue Committee. Shaun joined the United Nations in 2007, where he focused primarily on rule of law programming in Africa, Asia, and Pacific. That's a very illustrious work experience, Shaun. And with that, I really would like to extend a very warm welcome to you on this LinkedIn Live session.
Thank you for that very generous introduction. And thank you for inviting me to be part of a warm-up discussion to the 8th Annual India and Sustainability Standards Conference. As you know, Nandini, it's been a very busy year in the sustainability area. There's been COPs on climate, biodiversity, desertification. There's a World Gender Equality Forum coming up, and the Food Systems Summit as well. We're very grateful that CRB has included the business and human rights agenda on the ISS agenda, and recognizing that it's the 10-year anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So it's a pleasure to be here, and we're glad to be on this on the agenda for the ISS.
Our pleasure to have you with us and to share, your keen insights on the topic. And we have a whole host of questions, difficult questions that we planned for you. And I'm going to start with perhaps the toughest of them all, Shaun. And
Okay.
here goes. Yeah. So, like you mentioned, business and human rights has been taking center stage. How then do you see global value chains getting restructured, evolving? What kind of dynamics do you see playing out when it comes to buyer supply relationships?
Yeah, thanks for that question. It's a question that it's a question I think about a lot, but I don't get asked very often to answer. So it's a real it's a real pleasure to have this chance to provide some thoughts on this. I would like to provide a more nuanced view on business and human rights than perhaps I and others have given in the past. I do think it's becoming central to a sustainability agenda, and yet it's how it's becoming central that's so interesting. First, let's take a step back and acknowledge that supply chains have been shifting in Asia and elsewhere around the world for some time now. Certainly before the UN Guiding Principles made its first footprints here in the region, and certainly before COVID-19, trade volumes had been dropping and supply chains had been shifting. And part of that is that there's been this greater scrutiny of globalization and a reconsideration, really, of global commitments to free trade. Particularly after COVID, though, or during and after COVID, you see governments looking at their national strategic interests more closely and seeing how globalization may be putting some of those strategic interests at risk. So it's been dampening enthusiasm in some countries for an expansion of supply chains. Now, the business and human rights agenda, is it driving? Is it central? I think it's in the pantheon of issues that's moving us towards a reconsideration of supply chains and ensuring sustainability of them. The business and human rights agenda is perhaps adding more weight or a different angle on during this period as we reconsider trade policy and international investment policy. But I do think that human rights considerations are part of that pantheon to reshape and reorient global value chains in the years to come. And if you look at three sectors in particular, you can see the three different ways this is happening or potentially will happen. So if you look at electronics, if you look at garments, and if you look at commodities, I don't have any pithy way of describing how each is impacted, but if we look at, for example, electronics and in particular data technology, you see how policymakers from advanced economies are looking more closely at sale, export, and manufacturing of surveillance technologies and sensitive technologies, sensitive products more closely. This was going on even before COVID-19, but the human rights elements are adding even additional scrutiny. So I said before COVID-19, indeed it was happening before COVID-19 because you had a rise of nationalism. You had tensions between two powers on either side of the Pacific calling into question the fairness of the trade deals that had been struck. But indeed, the human rights dimension actually puts more fire puts more fuel on the fire of that conversation. And we're seeing, for example, that there are prosecutions going on now in multiple countries of business people who have broken export control laws when they've sold sensitive technologies, for example, to Myanmar or to the government there that is currently in power. There has been additional layers of scrutiny too, not just to sensitive technologies, but of smartphone and other communication and or tech products. So smartphones, of course, the manufacture of them and the use of them are geared towards a lot of data absorption. At the same time, we're seeing a lot of data localization laws being passed and a lot of surveillance laws being passed that are undercutting privacy, undercutting freedom of opinion and expression. And so those manufacturers, if you talk to them privately and in a constructive and understanding tones, they will admit that there's less appetite than before to expand manufacturing facilities in some economies in Asia because of those risks, because of data localization laws, because of the increased scrutiny of export control laws, et cetera. So here's one way, for sure, the business and human rights agenda or the human rights considerations are shaping global supply chains. If we move to garments, now fast fashion brands have been under pressure for some time, even before COVID, before, again, the UN guiding principles started making presence known here in Asia. But after COVID, there's even more pressure on fast fashion brands. There was this consumer movement to ensure that the largest garment companies paid fair wages or honored contracts that had already been signed, that they didn't just cut and run out of places like Bangladesh and India, et cetera. And the pressure to increase living wages become much more palatable. Now, they're also facing, I think, the sharp end of any mandatory human rights due diligence legislation out of the European Union, because there is just much more appetite or interest in getting the fast fashion brands to be more transparent and be held accountable to the actions of their suppliers, both to their suppliers, but also for their behavior. So they're caught between two forces. And you know, the brands I've spoken to recently, and talking about the biggest ones, they have, I feel like they have the interests of the workers and of their supply chain workers, or workers in their supply chain at heart. Many of them don't want to leave places like Myanmar because they know it will mean the sudden loss of jobs for thousands of women. They want to stay there and do the right thing, but they're finding it a harder thing to sell internally. What is the return on investment in staying in countries where there are difficult political circumstances? What is the return on investment for sticking it out in countries where human rights risks continue to rise, especially the smaller markets? So we're not sure exactly how this will shake out, but there is a lesson learned here with regards to the commodity sector. Now, that's the third sector I mentioned. You know, again, commodities have been under pressure, particularly in the mining and extractives sector for some time because of conflict mineral disclosure laws. And yet today we're also seeing an increased willingness to use forced labor import bans to get companies in the commodity sector to take greater control of their supply chain. Or control is maybe the wrong word, but to provide for just greater transparency on how they're procuring materials in certain countries. And of course, if you look at the impact of conflict minerals regulations, a lot of companies did say, this is not worth it anymore. And they have pulled out of high risk but high return African economies in particular. But we don't want that to happen for smaller countries with less to offer the global marketplace, perhaps like Myanmar, perhaps like Cambodia. But that is in their mix. That is what they're talking about. And in this subject with regards to the commodities sector is so salient. Even yesterday, the US government issued what they call a withhold release order against the products from a company called Supermax in Malaysia. This is a big rubber company. They produce, I believe, rubber gloves and other things. This is the fifth withhold release order, or the fifth ban on imports from Malaysia in 15 months. So this has really big bottom line implications for companies that are creating jobs, creating value, generating revenues. They go into health and education provision in these countries. So there are very big implications, not just for the company's bottom line, but the ability for governments to meet the needs of their people, for governments to meet sustainability concerns. So the events that Supermax are facing is, frankly, it's not just them. It's companies also in the palm oil industry as well. Palm, rubber, et cetera, are all facing increased scrutiny. And they're going to face even more as Australia and the European Union develop laws that are in play right now, processes in play right now, to develop legislation that mirrors the U.S. Forced labor laws that they have in practice. So, I mean, I could go on and on about how value chains are being shaped by the business and human rights agenda. I think these three sectors present three different kinds of ways that things are that are shaping new or helping policymakers to reconceptualize globalization. But note too, it's important to know it's mostly the policymakers in the global north that are demanding this transparency, and yet there is a market movement that's happening too, and I think that's something for maybe discussion later. But more than anything else, the market is changing the environment in which we work. It's not just policymakers with new legislation and new strategic interests on the agenda. It's also the marketplace. Companies are starting to respond now because they feel it from their own customers, the clients, the consumers of first order. They're most valuable. And of course, there's the investor class as well to speak to. So market forces, but also big changes in policy and that are being impacted by or weighted by human rights considerations are making for a very different landscape than what we're used to.
Thank you, Shaun. That was super insightful and very informative. And I think the sectors that you picked are probably one of the most sort of pertinent and most, in terms of social, economic impacts, probably, the right mix for the entire region, I'd say so. And I think one thing that sort of struck out and, stood out for me was, the emphasis on really the market forces also, that you have the whole policy landscape that's evolving and advancing in a certain direction, but you also see, a similar sort of a scenario building in the marketplace and almost parallelly or in tandem and kind of affecting each other. And then also the point on, the investor awareness, the consumer awareness, and how these particular stakeholders are going to be, key to the whole evolving space that we see, and how business and human rights is then going to sort of, lead the way in terms of, sort of contouring the way businesses function, think, and make decisions. Thank you so much. I would perhaps now want to move to the second question, which is sort of more macro. So really moving from really supply chain dynamics to, looking at regional level developments. What do you think perhaps are some of the very important key developments, perhaps that you already see, and some that you perhaps see in the near future emerging, which are going to impact the whole business space?
Well, maybe I'll just stick with your theme on the market and forces shaping the market. Even as we talk about the region, what are things moving the region? And of course, it's an intelligent question. It makes sense to answer, but at the same time, you'll also acknowledge the region is super diverse. And as my colleague Nusrat Khan from UNDP said in an earlier session with you on LinkedIn Live, each country is going at its own pace with regard on its business and human rights journey. And maybe I'll speak to more of the policy developments in the second half of an answer. But what are the nature of the market forces taking shape? Of course, the investor class, is very, very vested, no pun intended, in ensuring that their responsible investment profiles heightened. I mean, this asset class, the ESG asset class, has ballooned to proportions that no one predicted, and we're seeing companies acknowledge that now. Thailand, in Southeast Asia at least, is very proud of the fact that it has more companies on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index than any other country, and certainly in Southeast Asia, maybe even broader than that. And they are taking up items such as these companies, that is, human rights due diligence in significant measure. I won't detail what human rights due diligence is because I think your audience is sophisticated enough to understand what I'm talking about. But essentially in Thailand, the biggest agriculture firms, the biggest oil and gas company, the biggest food and beverage companies, they've actually invested in a business and human rights academy to train up at scale their employees, and even their clients and customers on human rights issues and human rights due diligence. In India, of course, I've been talking to some of India's largest conglomerates, and internally and quietly, they're developing capacity training tools to, again, between companies and cross functions within companies to make sure everybody's on board. In fact, I had a conversation not too long ago with a large conglomerate who said, we think one of the big reasons we lost a deal with another M&E was because we didn't have a human rights policy and we hadn't been conducting human rights due diligence, and they thought it was just too risky. I mean, it's one of several issues, of course, but they lost a big deal with the customer, with a potential partner, and so they're seeing that bottom line get impacted. The other conversation I had recently was with a semiconductor firm in Malaysia. And this sustainability professional in the semiconductor firm said, I've had more conversations in the last 2 years on human rights risks and fielding more questions with investors on the phone over the last 2 years than I have in 20 years of working in this industry. And again, that really shows you the power of the market. This is not because, oh, there's this policy shift, I need to now report on things, I need to look at things. There actually hasn't been that many policy developments in Asia to speak to. We can instead speak to the number of new transactional, the transactional work coming out of the large law firms in our region that are saying, yeah, we're including human rights into termination clauses of contracts. We're bringing in human rights due diligence in our consideration of mergers and acquisitions or joint ventures. So transactional work is being affected too. Now, this is not to say that governments aren't doing their part, but they are behind the market. And that's the case in many ways. Government is consensus-based, and it's not supposed to move as fast as the private sector, frankly. And policymakers in Asia are catching up. Thailand, Japan, and Pakistan, in chronological order, have developed national action plans on business and human rights. And you'll know, of course, that these national action plans are important because they're basis for review of legislation. They bring in different parties to the table, business, government, and civil society, to talk about gaps and what have you in policy and law. So, but these three countries rather, have signaled to the international investor community, but also buyers and other business partners about the seriousness in which the country is taking human rights impacts or risks, either in its supply chains or by its companies. So these important signals too, though, they're being, I think India is very close to releasing a draft national action plan on business and human rights to the general public. Malaysia will probably do one, or reportedly will have one out in the first quarter of next year. Indonesia is still is investing heavily in a national action plan design process now. Perhaps a draft will be provided as early as this coming November at a regional conference that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is hosting. So we're getting a lot of traction on the policy space, but mostly on national action plans. What's going to happen next, and perhaps the Joint Secretary GK Singh from the Ministry of Corporate Affairs will talk more about India's work. We're going to see, I think we're going to see next, after these national action plans, legislation mandating human rights due diligence, and even stronger legislation than we see on corporate reporting and corporate disclosures on non-financial risks, including human rights. So the market is definitely moving the players, the big players in the major sectors, and major industrial sectors, but also policymakers are catching up. They're starting with national action plans, and hopefully we'll see legislation develop in phase 2 of policy development space.
Right. Thank you so much, Shaun, for that response. a very comprehensive sort of an overview of, what's happening both at a national, regional level, and sort of, contrasting it with the policy space and the market space. And, you've in part sort of answered my next question, which is really, where do you see some of the emphasis being, the priority areas, be it corporate disclosures, human rights due diligence, all of those things. But perhaps what I'd like to maybe, sort of get your sort of views on is, you talked a lot about how there is pressure building from a lot of these multinationals, most of these entities are sort of based or headquartered in the West. So there is also this whole debate that you see emerging where, you're talking about this proverbial north-south divide, and you see that there is, of course, all that pressure that's mounting, but it is kind of cascading and trickling down to the supply chain with not much capacity building or hand holding. So how do you sort of see the whole balance, so getting the balance right and kind of seeing that while of course this is extremely important, there is also of course the realities and the peculiarities of a developing country, and how then sort of bring a little some sort of a balance in terms of expectations or managing those expectations given the whole policy and the market sort of dynamics.
Yeah, a fantastic question, and I'm glad that you've also just pinpointed, you've spotlighted a divide, because there is a divide. There is a divide between global north and south in this conversation. The global north has the luxury of demanding these things of its companies, and then when it says and your supply chains, not just your operations here in the global north, but also in your supply chains wherever they may be, it's tough on suppliers. They're all often working at low margins to begin with in highly competitive spaces, and with less capacity, of course, in some circumstances. And you know what? That fact was recently acknowledged by the senior trade advisor of the European Union External Action Service, a gentleman named Gus Huiten. In a conversation I had with him on human rights due diligence at a launch event for our training facilitation guide on human rights due diligence, little plug there. He said we can't let human rights due diligence, the weight of it, be borne by the most upstream providers in the supply chain. It can't be borne by the most vulnerable people in the supply chain. And one reason is because they saw what happened in Africa. Companies just said, you know what, we're just not going to work in the Great Lakes region anymore. And we're just not going to provide that revenue, those jobs, that income to the people who live there, who are the most vulnerable because of these regulations. Now, I mean, I'm overstating the case. There's different reasons why companies may be entering now and have left in the past in some of the Great Lakes economies, but Great Lakes and Africa economies. But indeed, there is that risk that you make it overly burdensome on the supply chain and on the perhaps not the weakest links, but in the areas of the supply chain with the slimmest margins. One moment. Thanks. And so there's that recognition, and it's one reason why we've seen the European Union, or perhaps it's one reason why we've seen a delay in the issuance of the EU proposed directive, I should say the European Commission's proposed directive on mandatory human rights due diligence. I think there has been a reconsideration of some of the elements in the first draft that might have been too tough, both on European companies, but also their suppliers. So there is that sensitivity. And there needs to be more dialogue. And then, following that, and then the same event, in fact, we're on a call with the head of sustainability, vice president of CP Group, which is one of Thailand's biggest agricultural companies. And the head of sustainability says, look, we're doing the most we can, but they're calling on, I think his message was more patience, more capacity building, and also more clarity. What is going to be demanded exactly? And how will we be holding each other accountable? It was another message from our colleague at CP Group. It is high time we had the conversation. If we can have a conversation in a constructive manner, it will be probably because it's been brought to the table in larger regional or international even economic forums. So I'm seeing as a way forward for that conversation to be had, but not just among sustainability people, and not just between a select group of people at the European Commission or the policymakers in the US or in Japan, but at regional economic forums like the G20, which India hosts, I think, at 2023, but also at the Economic and Social Commission of Asia and the Pacific, which is, of course, near to me because of its UN affiliation. There are also other opportunities. For example, although India is not a member, but in the APEC forums, which will be hosted by Thailand in 2022 next year. And indeed, it may have responsible business as one of the themes. Secondly, another forum would be in the trade negotiations. And I think in May of this year, India restarted negotiations with the European Union on an FTA, a new free trade agreement. There's a conversation there between what capacity building and how do you iterate demands for more responsible business practices through a trade agreement. Will there be a trade and sustainability clause like they had that the EU and Vietnam agreed to in their FTA a couple of years back? That trade agreement, by the way, is considered the most progressive trade agreement in history, in global history, because of things like the trade and sustainability clause. What will India's demands be in return if they do agree a trade and sustainability chapter, sustainability clause in an FTA with the EU? So there's a place for that dialogue to happen as well. And then perhaps lastly, I made mention of the COPs on desertification, climate change, and I think there's one on biodiversity too. These are forums that need to take on industry impacts more fully. Certainly, the climate change one is pinpointing industries that are the most egregious in their contributions to carbon emissions. But having in those contexts more of a dialogue on due diligence, for example, environmental and human rights due diligence is warranted, and being on an equal playing field, because it's in those economic forums, the trade forums or trade negotiations, on outcome documents in I was about to say communities, but conference of party agreements or outcome documents thereof, commitments thereof. That's where the negotiation, that's where the balancing can take place. But we have to talk pointedly about the issues and not in vague terms anymore. The urgency of climate change and the urgency by which global value chains may be losing their resilience in Asia and losing their impact for job creation, for value creation in Asia is at risk. It's a matter of urgency now, and the highfalutin diplomatic talk needs to be better informed by detailed discussions about what the human rights risks that are the most salient, and also what are the environmental challenges that need to be addressed either all at once or in any particular pecking order or any priority order of priority. Sorry. Wow, a very long response. I wasn't anticipating that to a very simple question. Thank you for asking.
No, thank you so much. I think that was a supremely well articulated response to the very complex and sort of a tiered sort of a question. And I think what you really said about dialoguing and sort of having very candid conversations, very pointed conversations, is sort of the need of the hour. You have also I can speak for India. You have national frameworks already in place. You have disclosure and reporting. You have the NGABRC. So I mean to also have those kind of conversations where perhaps the regional countries or countries like developing countries can sort of talk and inform the international community of the developments are some things that are needed and required. So I think a fantastic response to that question on the whole north-south divide, which can perhaps be mitigated or reduced through dialogues. So fantastic. I wish I had more time, Shaun, but I'm going to squeeze in one last question, which is really on how UNDP is championing this agenda of business and human rights at a regional level, and what are some of your focus areas?
Thank you. We're doing so much right now. It's hard to really categorize it all and to say which one is our focus. That's one of our problems. We have so many different work streams because there's so much work to be done. It's hard to really pinpoint at the end what's the most important stuff we're doing and how we're taking the work forward in any meaningful way. There's just so many things, but I think they could be grouped into maybe three categories. One, we're going to continue hosting regional forums in South Asia, but also out of Bangkok at a wider Asia scale every March and every June of the year. So be in touch. Be aware of the big March conference next in Southeast Asia on business and human rights. And then again in June. Those forums are really helpful because you bring together the toughest CSOs and the on-the-ground policymakers and business leaders in one room to have a constructive conversation about progress made and challenges that they're meeting. Two is our publication profile. The truth is there's not a lot of research being done on business and human rights impacts in Asia. And so we're trying to fuel that. We're putting more money in the hands of academics to study this. We have some recent reports out of Malaysia I'd like to point your audience to, and some coming out of Sri Lanka soon, and indeed in India as well. Maybe 2 or 3, they're going to come out in batches. So look for those publications. We're developing tools, and I mentioned the Human Rights Training Facilitation Guide. There's an actual reference to a software tool where companies can be sort of counseled on how, not counseled, but can try their hand at prioritizing salient human rights risks. So an important tool there that we've developed. And we are working with civil society very closely, developing partnerships with them, especially those that are serving beneficiaries and those most vulnerable in those supply chains. And of course, there's the important work that we're doing with CRB and other organizations in India. Our joint efforts, including today's discussion, are going to raise the profile of the business and human rights agenda. Also, government initiatives too, like SEBI's business responsibility and sustainability report requirements, and their NAP, of course, goes without saying. I'm just looking forward to future conversations, and really looking forward to October 28th, I think, when our session on business and human rights takes place. I think maybe it's around 2:00. Another plug. I'm really looking forward to the ISS conference, and I'm really happy to have been here today.
Super. Thank you so much for sharing all these perspectives and insights. It's been a rather educative and informative session, perhaps one of the best that I have maybe moderated, been in. And absolutely, I think just reiterating what Shaun said, please join us for the session on the 28th of October, 2 to 3:30 p.m. I promise you it's going to be super, super interesting. But yeah, keep in tune, keep in touch, and keep sort of getting notifications on the the business and human rights and the conference, the 8th annual conference. And with that, I think it's a wrap. I'd like to thank Shaun once again for joining us today. So thank you very much, and thank you to all the viewers.
Take care, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye.